Societies rarely collapse overnight. More often than not, they decline slowly, rotting from the inside as they become more corrupt, less competent, more restrictive, and quite frankly, harder to navigate with each passing year. And there's plenty of evidence that we're experiencing that right now. I mean, let's just scan the checklist with what's going on in the homeland right now. We've got massive economic and wage stagnation. We have insane levels of political corruption and turmoil. We have faith in public institutions are at an all-time low, and there is extreme societal polarization that's dominating the news cycle. And that's just off the top of my head. So in this episode, we're going to look at the possible paths historically that societies take as their institution begin to weaken and they decline. And then I want to try to lay out a practical framework based on historical examples for how you can position yourself to survive, adapt, and preserve what matters in an age of growing instability. So that's what we're going to cover today, gang. But before we do, I want to give a quick shout out to my premium subscribers on Substack. Highly appreciate you guys. If you would like to upgrade your subscription and get access to a team room, that is where we meet once a quarter to do a deep person-to-person, well, online at least, but where we get face-to-face and talk and do a little deeper dive into these topics. If that's something you'd like to do, you head over to our Substack page and upgrade your free subscription. All right, without further ado, we're talking about navigating the long descent, positioning yourself in an age of institutional decay. It's all on the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, and we're starting right now. Welcome back to the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, the show that gives you the tips and tools you need to make yourself stronger, faster, and harder to kill. All right, gang, let's get into it. So this is the third and final installment of our series, which began with, that was aptly titled, "The Civil War Has Been Canceled Until Further Notice." If you haven't listened to those two episodes, don't worry, this episode can stand on its own. I'll get you spun up on what you missed. But so here's how this is going to go. First, I'm going to give you a quick down and dirty on episodes 1 and 2. Second, we're going to talk about where systems in managed decline actually tend to go historically. And then third, and this is probably the most important part, we're going to talk about what you can actually do about it instead of, don't you get sick of those cats that are just constantly black pilling you and telling you, you know, the sky is falling, and then at the end they offer you no solution. They just say, wake up, wake up. Well, I think everybody's awake. I think everybody knows that something is afoul in the state of Denmark, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? So so that's what let's just get into it. So let's do a quick recap of episode 1. Right. So in episode 1, I did push back against a very popular narrative it's a perennial one, which means it kind of comes in, a lot of people talk about it, then it'll kind of get fade out. You don't hear as much, and then it comes back. It's just kind of one of those things that's on the repertoire of the main talking heads, and that is the United States is on the verge of a conventional civil war. And it is a compelling idea. It is dramatic, and it will definitely get you views and clicks. But as a model, I personally think it's flawed. And there are plenty of people out there with maybe even better resumes than me that would disagree with me. Even a lot of people that I follow and have a lot of respect for. It's just on this topic, I disagree. I don't think we're headed that way. To be fair, though, the societal fractures, the divisions are there. The things that people are seeing. I mean, nobody's making this stuff up. The conditions are definitely there to spin one of these things up. I'm not denying that. But as I explained in episode 1, the modern system in which we live in today does not need to suppress unrest by brute force. In fact, it's not even in its best interest to do so. It's much better to prevent possible uprisings from cohering in the first place. Because the fact is, as I went on in that episode, the fact is that with near total surveillance on somebody, the administrative levers of power, the economic leverage, incentives and disincentives, if that's a word, and the narrative management all does a much better job in this current climate than tanks out on the street with a lot less risk to boot. So in effect, the governing elites compete within the system rather than destroying it. And I went on pretty deep on how that works. That there's rules to the game, so to say, and they get a lot further ahead by just competing within the system, doing damage to it, no doubt, but by helping it remain intact, because a total collapse would threaten everybody at the top. Now, I did say in that episode that there were certain indicators that I would look at, that if those things were present, that would change my mind about where I think we're headed. At this point, I don't see those indicators. If you want to know what those are, go back and listen to episode 1. The link is in the show notes. So instead of a revolution, instead of a civil war, we get managed decline. And that leads us to episode 2, where I described that the state we're now in is managed decline, otherwise known as the long descent. One of my favorite authors and guests that I've ever had on the show, the mighty John Michael Greer, coined the phrase the long descent. I think he wrote a book by that name too, to describe the slow decline in industrial civilization. And I think his framework is useful to understanding the environment we're living in. So I'm going to take his theory of long descent and I'm going to riff off of it a little bit and call it, add to it a little bit, and I will phrase it as quote unquote managed decline, which is a prolonged period where institutions weaken. And when I say weaken, what I mean by that is that they become so corrupt and inefficient at fulfilling their duties to the citizenry that public trust continues to erode, but the system in and of itself does not collapse, at least not immediately, right? A collapse may occur, but it's not going to be anytime soon. I think there's still a little gas in the tank, so to say. I think that these folks can fleece us and drive this thing downhill for a little while longer. So instead, the elites continue to compete within this existing structure while shifting the cost and risk downwards to you and I, using financial, regulatory, and even now the digital leverage to contain unrest and preserve their position. I've also done other episodes. I think there's one out there a while back ago, last year, called "Who Are the Elites?" Where I look at elite theory with authors like John Michael Greer, Peter Turchin, and others. So you can check that one out too. So where was I? So the whole deal with civil wars is that they require energy. They require surplus energy, right? People who are able to participate and sustain that type of upheaval for the long term. So they require people who are economically mobile, socially bonded, and structurally independent enough that can absorb that risk, right? That can absorb the risk of stepping out of line, so to say. They require large numbers of individuals who can coordinate, finance, and sustain prolonged disruption. Managed decline, that's what I mean by surplus energy. So managed decline has the capacity to remove all that surplus energy. So when most people are already financially leveraged, digitally traceable, reputationally exposed, right? They can't afford sustained defiance. And I'll give you some examples here in a second. They may be angry, sure. They may be cynical, absolutely. But they're also constrained and dependent within the system. And that is the key difference. So instead of mobilization, you get exhaustion, right? It's a controlled burn that eventually just fizzles out. Yeah, you might have some quote, mostly peaceful, unquote, protests out on the street. You might have a couple of, people blocking roadways or people demonstrating, things like that. But in the end, if you notice, right, even all the way back to Occupy Wall Street, they just have a tendency just to fizzle out, right? So instead of a civil war, you get a population that just continues to adapt to the tightening conditions while the institutions just continue to hollow it out from above. And that is the difference between revolutionary breakdown and managed decline. One explodes, but the other, the latter, constricts. So it's a decay without any kind of rupture. So instead of our civilizational collapsing, we just get this continued slow constriction, right? So where can this go? Managed decline is not stable forever, though. While it moves slow, it does have an endpoint, right? All things come to an end, right? But and historically, it tends to move in a few recognizable directions. These were some that, just based on my research and look around, these were the big ticket items. You might be able to add to the list. If you do, comment below. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. But try not to think of managed decline so much as a status or a point in time. It's more like a slow grinding process. It's slow, so that it's sometimes hard to know where exactly you are in the process. And maybe that's the whole point of it. So let's look at these possible paths. So path one would just be continued bureaucratic stagnation. So this is the slow suffocation of a system under its own weight. So the institutions don't disappear. In fact, they grow, they accumulate. There's more layers of administration that build upon each other. The rules multiply. There's more regulation. There's more statutes. There's more people putting their hands in your pocket and telling you what you can and what you can't do with your money and with your time. And then the process becomes increasingly rigid. But the increase in the structure doesn't translate into effectiveness, right? As the bureaucracy grows, it doesn't become more efficient. It usually turns into the opposite. And so what you end up with is a system that is highly organized on paper, but increasingly dysfunctional in practice. So a historical example of this would be in the late empire, right? Particularly in its western half, falling during the 4th and 5th centuries CE, right? We are well past the days of the Republic. We are in the time of Constantine, and then into the time where Christianity has now become the dominant religion of the state, right? And so as external pressures increase, right, from the frontiers, right, internal cohesion weakened. And there's a lot of demographic stuff we could get into. I don't have time to cover that now, but it's very interesting. But the imperial response was not to simplify or decentralize, but to double down on its own administrative control. So taxation increased, and it became more restrictive as the government tried to stabilize revenues that were coming into the treasury. So to do this, occupations became fixed. And I mean permanently. So if your dad was a carpenter, guess what your job was going to be, right? The state was literally attempting to nail the system into place, right, to stabilize revenues. But that rigidity came at a cost. It actually had the inverse effect. So economic activity slowed, local initiative declined, and as corruption increased, not necessarily because people became more immoral, but just because navigating the system required you to do that, right? Over time, the official structure remained intact, but the real functioning of society began to shift away from it, and people began to rely more on local relationships, informal agreements, and workarounds on the systems. So from the inside, that kind of environment doesn't feel like just a systemic collapse, right? It feels like friction, right? Everything takes more effort. Everything requires a negotiation. The system is still there, but it's no longer efficient enough that you can rely on it, right? And in our age, things aren't as locked down, but they might as well be. I mean, think about all the rules and regulations and the red tape one has to go through just to start a business. And I don't mean like, hey, I'm a painter, I'm a one-man shop. You know, that's relatively simple enough until it comes time to do your taxes and stuff, and then you'll see how rough that is. But if you wanted to start it on scale, like to start something big or to create a product that you would then have to patent and that you would have to try to introduce into public commerce, right? The bar for many people, the bar to entry is just too high, right? So instead of building wealth and the autonomy that comes along with it, people are reduced to just being a wage slave. Now, some of us out there might have the fortune enough of being a high income earner, but if you get a W-2 at the end of the year, then you are a wage slave nonetheless, right? That's path one. Path two would be soft totalitarianism. We're going to go real deep on this one in a second, but I'll give you the lowdown on it. This is otherwise known as administrative or technocratic control, and this is where the system responds to instability, not by slowing down, but by tightening up. And the authority becomes more concentrated, but it doesn't necessarily present itself in overdramatic ways. It's more of an indirect force that controls and operates through systems of access. So modern societies especially are uniquely positioned for this because so much of daily life runs through institutional channels. Think about employment, financial transactions, communication platforms, licensing systems, regulating frameworks. These are not just ancillary structures, they're infrastructure for everyday life. And when access to that infrastructure becomes conditional, control then becomes subtle and more effective. So historically, you can, and I'll give a contemporary example of this as well, but historically, you can see elements of this in late stage bureaucratic regimes. But in a modern context, and pay close attention to this, the mechanism is more distributed. So it's not just the state acting in isolation, right, to oppress you or to control you. It's a network of institutions. Some are public, but some are private, right? That collectively define what the boundaries of acceptable behavior are. Like I heard John Robb, who just go check him out. Last name is R-O-B-B. He was an Air Force guy, engineer, brilliant person, has written books, got a pretty white hot blog. Where he gets into all this kind of stuff. But I once heard him in an interview saying that terms of service, right? You remember every time you sign up for something on the internet, you have to agree to the terms of service, all that kind of stuff. He's like, that is quickly replacing the Bill of Rights. And I thought that was incredibly profound because that in actually has much more control over what you do or what you don't do than what the actual government does, right? And what makes this form of control particularly stable is that it doesn't rely on constant enforcement. It doesn't rely on enforcement, it relies on alignment. So most people don't need to be forced at gunpoint to do it, right? They adjust preemptively. They stay within the lines because the cost of stepping outside of them, it's clear, even if it's not explicitly stated, right? So again, for those of us in the inside, it doesn't always feel like we've got a boot on our neck. It feels like navigating a system with invisible edges, right? You move freely up to a point, but most people don't know quite exactly where those lines are drawn. So if you're fuzzy on what this looks like, think about the stories you've heard about people who lost their jobs or had their businesses upended over a social media post, right? Or what about the professors, authors, and public speakers who've been quote unquote canceled because a certain group didn't like what that person had to say? So whether you believe those people deserve to be deplatformed is not relevant. It's beside the point. The issue is that the canceling of people over their thoughts, their views, or opinions, right, encourage other people, maybe even yourself, right, to self-censor themselves voluntarily. And that is the point. So ultimately, the system and that soft totalitarian model doesn't need to send the Stasi out to your house to knock on your door at 2 a.m. when you misbehave. They have other less intrusive ways to get your compliance. Path three is what I call Warlord Incorporated. This is actually partly a title of a book that I reviewed a while back. I think the name of that episode, I put that in the show notes, is Warlord Inc., The Rise of of the warlord entrepreneur, something like that. You'll find it in the show notes. But that's where that comes into play. So fragmentation, right, doesn't mean that these systems disappear overnight. It just means the system loses its ability to maintain consistent authority across the board. So the power doesn't collapse, it just redistributes itself through other players. So it moves away from centralized governmental institutions and into smaller, more localized, even private networks, right? Some of those networks are formal, many of them are not. So in the book, oh, here it is. I put it in my notes. The book was Warlords Inc., Black Markets, Broken States, and the Rise of the Warlord Entrepreneur. Right? This is where the authors in this book argue that when states become unable, right, or unwilling to provide basic public goods like security, infrastructure, economic opportunity, things like that, other actors will move in to fill that vacuum. So unlike older revolutionary movements driven primarily by ideology, many modern non-state actors operate according to economic incentives. So these groups function less like traditional insurgencies and more like adaptive enterprises. They use logistics, finance, smuggling networks, black market economies, things like that to exert control over supply chains and accumulate more power and resources. So in many regions, they basically become a parallel governing structure. They may provide protection, enforcing orders, maintaining local monopolies where official institutions have become weak or maybe absent altogether. So the book also suggests that in an increasingly interconnected and fragile global system, the distinction between legitimate institutions and illicit networks can become less clear as they both rely on similar methods of adaptation and influence and control to survive in these environments. So an example of this could be the mob, or the Sicilian mafia, or even the modern drug cartels. Right? These groups gain influence in regions where the state just cannot outcompete them. It cannot provide reliable security and economic and opportunities or manage disputes. And in some areas, these groups function as a parallel power structure, right? They enforce rules. They can create jobs, right? A lot of these criminal organizations have legitimate businesses that are operating, that they can create jobs for the locals. They can provide financial assistance to the community in exchange for loyalty and compliance. The state still exists. The federal government will still exist, and it may still maintain a certain level of influence and authority in these areas, but it is quickly and consistently hollowed out by these warlords, right? So that's what it looks like in those. And then in the third world, you think about a place like Somalia or even things like that, where you literally have armed roving bands, rolling around on the street, right, that are non-state actors that are exerting control over a region or territory, right? So that would be that. And then, of course, part 4 is hardcore totalitarianism. Usually when we think about totalitarianism, we're thinking about Soviet-era style regimes, other dictatorships, maybe across the Middle East like that, for example. I'm not going to say a lot because I think everybody should have a decent idea of what that looks like, right? So that's also a path that your society or civilization can go to on its way down to decline, as it's headed south on the decline train. So where are we now? Well, in my opinion, I don't think we're operating at any one of the extremes. I definitely don't think we are setting ourselves up for the Warlord Inc. scenario, but I did want you to make aware of it, since we were just kind of broad brush 30,000 foot view in this thing. But I would say we're somewhere in the middle between the bureaucratic stagnation path and the soft authoritarian control path. That's kind of where I see us, where we're at and where we're going. And you can feel these elements at work in the day-to-day grind. So, which leads us to my next point that I want to talk as I'm setting us up for what we're going to do about it. And another book that I want to refer you to, which is called Live Not by Lies, right? Uh, Um, I came across this. It was very helpful to me in sketching out a plan for how to navigate the waters that we find ourselves heading into. And this book is written and authored by this guy named Rod Dreher, Dreher. I put a link to his book down below in the show notes. And Dreher argues that unlike the violent, state driven communist regimes of the 20th century, modern totalitarianism is consumerist. It is technology and culturally driven and often championed by corporations and institutions more so than the state, or at least them acting in concert together. So, Live Not by Lies recounts the stories from survivors of Soviet era regimes who detailed the manner and methods they used to maintain their faith, their family, and their community in the face of political and cultural oppression. The book really does serve as a guide for how you can find strength and build resilient communities in the face of bitter opposition or even persecution. And there's a lot I think we can learn from Dreher's book as we find ourselves moving towards a form of soft totalitarianism if we're not already there in the initial stages of it. And a system where conformity is enforced not through overt violence, but through social pressures, institutional alignment, and in some cases, economic consequences. I think Dreher is picking up on something real here, which is that control in modern society often doesn't come directly from the state. It comes from, like I said, those social and cultural and economic networks. So it operates in your workplace, on digital platforms, financial systems, and other systems. And I've already given examples of that, right? These systems shape behavior by defining what thoughts, what words, and what behaviors are acceptable. And they can exclude you if you step outside of that. Again, like I mentioned earlier, just think of the people who have been canceled, right? Who have been deplatformed, right? Who had their businesses that they were running online that were tied to a social media platform that then got locked out of their account for violation of community standards, but weren't even given a which standard they violated, and they had no recourse. It just boom, gone. You stepped out of line, boom, there goes your business, right? If you think this doesn't affect you because you're not an influencer or some public figure, I would urge you to think again, because we already have all the pieces in place for a social credit system, right? Let's look at it. Your financial behavior is already tracked through credit scores and transactional histories. Your professional reputation is shaped by employers, right? Licensing boards and industry networks, right? People who can follow you online, who have access to that, at least maybe to a limited extent, depending on whether all of us are online in some way, right? But some maybe more than others. But your online presence, what you say, what you support, or more importantly, what you don't support, right? The things you don't click like on, the things you don't share, right? The things you don't comment on, that may say something about you as well to these folks, right? The groups and movements you associate with, all that and more is recorded. It is searchable, and increasingly it's permanent. So, individually, those systems are limited, but as they become more connected, right, they start to form something more powerful that affects all of us. But Dreher also emphasizes something important. And this, I highly recommend you get this book. May not agree with everything, maybe not find everything applicable, but he really does have some things that hit pretty hard, and that resistance, right, based on the historical case studies he reviews, that resistance in this environment doesn't start with the large scale action. It doesn't erupt with the revolution, right? But it does start at the individual level. So what does that look like? Well, hang with me. I'm about to get to that. So up to this point, everything we've discussed has been important and observational. Now that we have an idea of what is happening And where it may be going, it's time to decide what we're going to do about it. So, what are the options? Well, the first option, and spoiler alert, not really an option that I would advise. I would call it a mistake that I find a lot of people falling into. I have found myself in this trap before, and that is just becoming a spectator. This is the most common response that I think is plaguing us right now, is just the spectator phenomenon, right? People watch and follow the news. They like and share posts. They emotionally react. They argue, but they don't change anything about how they live. That's the mistake, right? Because spectatorship creates a false sense of engagement, right? You feel like you're informed. You feel like you're involved, right? But you're really just spinning your wheels. I can't tell you how many times that I've had well-meaning people that I'm close to blow up my phone on the latest, whatever the outrage is, whatever this politician is doing, whatever this pundit or talking head has said, this show, they're having this whistleblower that's, all, gonna just, blow the lid off the can and then what, right? Nothing changes. Right. And I'm not saying that you got to hold your head under the ground or pretend like nothing's going on around you, that you're not informed, but it's getting caught up in the drama and thinking that you're in on it, that you're pushing the needle forward somehow because you're really finding out what's going on behind the curtain. Right. That's pretty much, I think, where the system wants you, because when conditions shift, right, spectators get left behind. Right. When you look at how people have navigated environments like this in the past, a few patterns show up consistently. And that is individuals who endured under life under the iron fist of communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe didn't succeed through large-scale resistance. It was built on something smaller and more durable in structure, like tight-knit groups of people who had full faith and trust in each other. They built families and informal networks that shared information, they shared resources, and more importantly, support. So instead of confronting the system head on at every turn, they found space within the system to operate inside of it. And in some instances, even thrived. And his book is chock full of examples of that. So one of the most important elements was that the development of parallel structures, not necessarily full underground economies, but smaller scale alternatives that reduced dependence on the official system, right? People traded skills. They relied on personal relationships, right, that were carefully cultivated. And they built a quiet support networks that operated alongside the lever of power rather than in direct confrontation with it. So at the same time, they may have been disciplined, all right, about where they were visible and where they weren't. And they understood that not everything needed to be said publicly and not every line needed to be tested or even crossed. But what made these groups durable over time wasn't just how they operated day to day, but and this, I think, is the critical piece of Dreyer's work, is how they preserve their identity and who they were, right? The culture wasn't just left to the institution, but their culture, their group culture was cultivated. It was created, nurtured, and cultivated and passed down intentionally within their families and within those small, trusted circles. So values, beliefs, traditions, these are reinforced privately, transmitted, delivered, and taught directly, and protected from outside pressure. And because of that, when the Iron Curtain came down in the 90s, right, these groups didn't have to rebuild from ground zero. They emerged with their identity intact, almost like they had been waiting just beneath the surface all along, because in effect they were, right? And that's the part people tend to overlook, in my opinion, is that survival isn't just about getting through the moment, but it's about playing the long game, right? You focus on maintaining continuity so that when the conditions change, you still know who you are. you still know what you stand for and you know how to operate. And I cannot stress this point enough. And oh, by the way, when those can't, when the conditions change, right, that may not even happen in your lifetime. Right. That is something I think in our day and age that we have completely lost touch of, that for our ancestors would have been non-negotiable, and really just the point of departure, or would have been the whole point of their existence, and that is preserving their bloodline, legacy, their identity, right? Their kinship networks, right? And investing in that network, knowing that it's going to outlive you, and sacrificing and investing yourself into that so that it would, right? And now that I feel like, the society definitely encourages just a sense of nihilism, where it's all about how are you going to survive and how are you going to maintain and how are you going to get through it, without really much thought of maybe there's a piece of this that's bigger than you that you should be rolled into, right? So let's get to the playbook. I'm going to lay out some guiding principles that you can begin to implement today. And when I say playbook, that's what I mean. I mean, these are principles, not a recipe. It's not a program. And it can't be, because we are all individuals from different walks of life with different experiences and skill sets. So not everything I do is going to work for you. And in contrast, there may be some things that you can execute easily that I could never pull off on my best day. And so the point is, the principles are universal, but the application may look a little different from person to person. And all that means, and I know this, you might not want to hear this, but this is the truth, is what that means is there's going to be some trial and error involved. But that's okay. Again, you just don't be a spectator. So the best time to start working on this would have been 10 or 15 years ago, but the second best time is to start today. Excuse me. So let's talk about a real world scenario. All right. Let's make it practical. So the best case scenario is you're in your late 20s, you're skilled in a trade, and you're living in a small urban, or even better yet, a rural environment. That's your best case scenario. The problem is most of us aren't in the best case scenario. So I'm not going to even muck with that one. I'm going to propose we work with something a little more challenging, a more challenging hypothetical that hits a little closer to home for probably the majority of us. So let's say that you're in your mid 40s or your mid 50s with a family and you have a mortgage. You might even be a professional living in some suburban or urban environment. So you're not a farmer. You're not really good at swinging a hammer either. So what do you do with this, right? Do you reinvent yourself? Do you sell your house, move out to the country and live off the grid, learning how to homestead? And look, hey man, I'm not telling you what to do with your life. I just don't think that's a viable option at this stage for most of us. If you're not already doing that already, that ship may have sailed, right? But again, I don't know you. I don't know your circumstances in detail. So, hey, if that is you and you can pull it off, hey man, and that's what you want to do, by all means, go ahead. But for a lot of us, I don't see that as viable. So here's the good news though, is you don't have to reinvent yourself. I don't even think you necessarily have to start over, but what you do need is to reposition yourself. So look, if that hypothetical dude, the second one that I just dreamed up, is a close match, you probably already have built up some valuable skill sets that will come in handy. You just got to recognize them and leverage them fully. So what are those things I'm talking about? Well, here's some things like life experience, good judgment, and common sense. That is in short order these days. Leadership and management skills, understanding of systems and how they operate. In a declining environment, those are more valuable if they're used the right way, not less. So the challenge is to reposition yourself so you can take advantage of your assets to the fullest. So right now, in a stable system, right, your value, if you're, some type of professional or you have some kind of occupation, right? Your value comes from your position inside the system. So your title, your credentials, your role, whatever it is, right? These things make you valuable to your family and peer group in this stage. But in a declining system, that's in its late stages, your value shifts becomes tied to something a little different, and that is your usefulness, your reliability, and the relationships you've formed. So that shift is already happening. Again, I don't know where we are in the cycle, but I think we can see that we are moving towards that end. And a lot of people just haven't adjusted to it yet. So what I think that you should do, and of course, some of this, there's a lot of people talking about this, but I want to do a little deeper dive on that, and that is building relationships. I've talked about it in prior episodes. Like I said, many other people out there have talked about this too, but I want to be a little bit more direct about it. This is foundational. Build relationships, not online. Build face-to-face relationships with real people. People who know you, trust you, and respect you. Because when systems become less reliable, people don't turn to the institutions first, right? They turn to each other. And if you don't have a network, then you're exposed. So how do you do this? What if you're some kind of introvert, right? And you just don't know how to work a room. You're not real chatty with strangers. You're not real good at building relationships, not because you're a jerk or anything. That's a skill set in and of itself, right? Well, if you are in that, that's going to be a challenge, but you're going to have to find a way. So if you don't have a close circle of friends, right, then you're going to have to go find some friends, and that's going to be a process that doesn't happen overnight. So where do you start? Start frequenting groups of like-minded people with common interests, your backgrounds, or shared experiences. So for instance, if you're a veteran and you don't have a lot of deep ties to your community, maybe you just moved in somewhere, right, because you transferred with a job or something, you just don't know a lot of people. Well, if you're a veteran, go check out the American Legion. Go check out Veterans of Foreign War if you're eligible to join. Whatever it is, and get involved. That's the key. Don't just join. Don't just show up. Get involved in whatever it is they're doing. That's how you get to know people. If you're a shooter, right, start attending some gun competitions and matches. Don't just compete. Don't just show up, shoot your match, grab your toys, and go home. Volunteer to help set up and run the matches. You're going to get to know a lot more people, right? They're always hurting for volunteers. Volunteers are appreciated, right? Volunteers, there's always that little shared misery, right? It's a hot day. It's a long day. You're dealing with all these people getting cranky, people laughing, having a good time, getting the whole mix of everything. And it's work. A lot of people don't like to work. So when you volunteer, right, that already bonds you on a very small level, but you do that enough times and you start getting to know people, right? And you start building that trust. And then you can start finding personalities that you are more aligned to and just kind of naturally gravitate to. But it all starts with getting involved. All right, say you're not a veteran, you're not a shooter. Do you like to garden? All right, I'm just spitballing here, but I'm sure there's a gardening club somewhere in your area that meets to discuss whatever people that like to garden like to talk about. I'm sure of it, that is there. So I think you see the pattern, right? Is that take your interest that you have and leverage it to build meaningful relationships with other people. All right, that's number one. Then number two, make yourself useful. I'm all about learning new skills, but you don't have to learn 10 new skills, right, to navigate this thing. But you do need to be someone who can solve problems. So, for instance, if you're a professional, you know how to navigate systems, provide clarity, and offer solutions. Those are your big ticket items. Even if you're not a professional, those are things that at this stage in your life, you probably know how to do, right? So what I mean by that is be the person that other people call when something's not working, right? You don't have to be the person that actually fixes it, but to be able to connect them through your network with the resources that creates value. And value persists as the system degrades. So I'll give you an example. Very low threat, right? Very non-sexy example, but it is one nonetheless. So I've got a buddy that's a realtor. If my garage door breaks down or my pipes back up or I got a leak in my roof, guess who I call? But the first person I call is my realtor buddy. I don't call a roofer. I don't call a plumber. The first person I call is my realtor buddy. Now, he has never once come out to my house to fix a homeowner issue. Never. But he's always provided me with the name of a professional who is vetted and knows how to resolve the issue. My realtor buddy is a valuable resource to me. He's the first person I think about when I have a homeowner issue that I can't fix on my own. So consequently, every time I have ever bought or sold a house, I use him as a realtor. And not only that, he's the only person I refer out to other people who are looking for a realtor. So you see how that works? Now look, you're not a realtor guy. I get it. You don't need to become one. And I'm not talking about just fixing people's homeowner issues. The takeaway is how to be a resource. You want to be a resource. You want to be valuable. You want to be someone that is in a position where when people have a problem, you're the person they think of, right? And you don't have to be the one that fixes it, but you can connect them to it. Right? In other areas of life. It doesn't have to just be homeowner stuff. That's what I'm talking about. All right. Number 3, and this one is going to be probably unorthodox, but where we are now in this stage of the game, I think it's pretty important. So you're finding quality people you can connect with. You're becoming an asset to the group by being a resource and someone people look to when they need help. Now it's time to look at your life, right? And begin to reduce your fragility or your dependence on the system. So you need to survey your affairs and say, where am I dependent financially, logistically, professionally, right? Those things. So you're never unless you are just a billionaire or millionaire or whatever, you're not ever going to eliminate dependency, but you can reduce it. That's the goal. You want room to maneuver. So I'm not a financial professional and I'm not giving out financial advice, but I do strongly urge you to seek the help of a financial advisor if you haven't done so already. And believe it or not, financial advisors are not just for rich people. You don't have to have $1 million in the bank to benefit from their services. A good financial advisor can review your finances, can help you identify your short-term and your long-term financial goals, and help you get from where you are to where you want to be. And the key with these guys is remember what I said about civilizations that are declining, right? The bureaucracy spreads, the rules and regulations grow. So if you get a seasoned financial advisor, their whole job is to keep up with all these expanding rules and regulations in their sector, right? That are so characteristic of a state in managed decline. A seasoned pro has seen his share of recessions, downturns, bubbles, busts, and a lot more. And he or she can help you navigate that chaos and build a little economic security and reduce your dependency upon the system. I don't really ever hear anybody talking about that. And I think that that's such a low hanging fruit one that, like, right now where we're at, this is the best time to, down in the future, who knows, but right now, this is the best time to seek that out if you haven't already, right? That is available to you. So give that one some thought. All right. And then 5th is now we go operational, so to say. So building relationships is a starting point, but at some point you got to move from just these general connections that you've been, going to golfing with or going gardening with or shooting competitions, whatever. You meet a lot of people. You've got a big circle, right? A wide range of people. You cast a wide net at first and you get to know people, you build trust. But during that time, you're vetting people. You're identifying who is reliable and who isn't. So over time, you begin to narrow down that group into a smaller, more intentional circle. right? That's based on trust and competence and character. I mean, you can still keep all those friends. You can still, I'm not saying cut them out of your life. I'm just saying that as things become more restrictive, as the constraints of soft totalitarianism or bureaucratic stagnation or whatever, as that vice begins to tighten, right, then and maybe even freedoms become more restrictive, right, that's where the inner circle, a group of people you can rely on when conditions become less predictable, that becomes the nucleus of your mutual assistant networks, the people who are going to be helping you and that you can help, right, when the chips are down. So the purpose of this small circle isn't just social, it's functional. So ideally it includes people with a wide range of knowledge, skills, and ability. So think in terms of who you want in this group in terms of their capability. Now, they've already have to have their value and their reputation proven for character, truthfulness, reliability, all that kind of stuff. But now you're trying to pull those folks in that have knowledge, skills, and abilities. So medical, mechanical, legal, logistical, financial, those kinds of things. If you can bring someone in the group who directly has those skills, like a doctor or a mechanic or a tradesman, that's ideal. But access matters too. If someone in your circle, right, maybe they're not, maybe someone like that is not in your circle, but you have someone that you have a trusted relationship with that does have someone with those capabilities or access to that, that still expands your reach, right? So what you're doing is building redundancy and depth in your network. Because in stable times, it's not that necessary, right? It's not that big a deal when things are stable. But in a strained system where access becomes inconsistent and institutions become less reliable, having people you can call on who can solve your problems or connect you to someone who can, that becomes one of the most valuable assets you can have, right? And of course, groups like this don't come together by accident. It takes intention, it takes time, and it requires a certain level of reciprocity on your end, right? You have to give back too and not just take. So you're not just building a network to draw from, but you've got to have something that you're bringing to the table as well. So wrapping it all up, at the end of the day, you're not preparing for a collapse or a Mad Max style shit hit the fan scenario, right? Those things may happen, but I think that is so far in the distance, right? What I'm doing, right, is preparing to live within a system that is just becoming less reliable, more complex, and more controlled all at the same time. Now, as that system finally runs its route, right, at some point it may collapse. I don't know if that's going to happen in our lifetime, in the lifetime of my kids or grandkids. Who knows, right? But it will give way to something else, right? But in the meantime, right, decline is the name of the game. That's what we're trying to prepare for. So some people, for some, the idea of moving to another country and living off the grid, that might be a viable option. But for most of us, it's just an escapist fantasy. But the good news is that there's plenty of data, there's plenty of information and historical examples of people who successfully surfed the wave of civilizational decline rather than being drowned by it. And they didn't withdraw completely. They repositioned themselves. They built relationships. They increased usefulness, and they reduced their exposure. And they built a group, a kinship network, where they built a culture and they transmitted that culture down to the next generation. So over time, they become the kind of people that others rely on when the system starts working the way it's supposed to. So they form those tight-knit groups of high trust. They pass that culture down and that legacy to the next generation. And they preserve a sense of identity that outlasted the system itself. So when the conditions finally did shift, right, they didn't emerge confused or fragmented or in a worse shape, right? They weren't worse off. They emerged prepared with a foundation already in place. And they did it, and so can we. But you got to start now. So, and that ends this episode. Guys, I hope this gave you something to think about. Hit me up. Let me know what you think. That concludes this series. I hope you enjoyed it. Other than that, I'm Mark. I'm signing off. I'm telling you to keep yourself sharp and keep it pulsing.